Campers, what is the most paranormal event that has occurred while you were camping? Part 2. Story 1. Normally, I am completely stoic and don't care for superstition or anything like that. I look on backwoods stories like these with a sort of bemusement and have told and been told plenty over the years. Tonight was different. I am a grown butt man, but moments ago I just started sobbing uncontrollably and got so nauseous I threw up my dinner. I don't know what the F is going on, but after reading about some of these encounters, it was like something clicked and I started remembering. First, a little background. I was a weird little kid, incredibly full of energy and supposedly really smart. I loved spending all day outside, roaming the foothills and getting lost, then finding my way home. I was totally fearless, and it really peed my parents off because, of course, they would get worried sick about me if I didn't come home on time or even until after dark. I loved exploring, finding the hidden places and searching for interesting bugs and animals. My parents were convinced I was going to grow up to be a scientist of some type. Yet, I had a sort of lack of respect for authority, and my constant failure to return on time resulted in some pretty serious groundings. My solution was to stop going out in the daytime and to start sneaking out at night. My nocturnal adventures began when I was about 12 years old. My range quickly increased from the neighborhood to the nearby golf course to the deep woods outside of town. I would sneak out around 12 a.m. and try to be back by 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. just before my dad woke up. I would use my morning shower to clean up, then stumble off to school like a zombie. Needless to say, my grades suffered and discipline measures became even stricter. Still, nobody could stop me from sneaking out and having my adventures in the night. This went on for years, and I never felt afraid, even when the cops were called on me occasionally, or someone shot off a gun, or when a huge buck stared me down after I stumbled upon a bunch of bedded down deer. I even heard a cougar scream once, close by. That got my heart pounding, but I never felt true terror. A sort of startled alertness maybe, but the total dark wilderness never held no power over me. I felt powerful and vital, like I was doing something that nobody else does and conquering something that was unassailable for others. Until one night. Tears are coming to my eyes now and a chill is running up my back as I type this. I never remembered fully what the event was that made me suddenly, utterly stop my exploration and totally shut myself inside. But reading these stories has seemed to open the door to something truly awful. I'm going to try to explain what I saw and felt and heard now, and you can draw your own conclusions. It was a very normal early summer night. Cool, no breeze, clear sky with the stars and moon shining so brightly that after getting used to dark, you can make out shapes and shadows fairly well. A perfect night for an adventure. I snuck out with my usual routine and quickly jogged out of the neighborhood and past the golf course. I had somewhere in mind where I wanted to go, and my plan was to head down a dry creek bed deeper into a small valley that I hadn't been before. Everything was going just fine, and it was exhilarating to be going somewhere new and breaking a new trail. I didn't get very far into the woods that night, though. Total silence was what made me stop. I remember it very clearly. Usually it was quite noisy with crickets and other insects, so loud that it was almost annoying at times, but I encountered an area of complete dead silence with only the sound of the breeze flowing through the pine trees. It was so odd and so sudden that I just stood stock still waiting, how I usually did, for some clue as to what was going on to present itself. Instead, an awful sensation flooded my body. A sort of welling dread that made the fine hairs on my arms and legs stand up, and on the back of my neck, too. It was electric and torturous, sheer, utter terror. Then, the scream happened, so I thought it was coming from above me. The worst sound I've ever heard in my entire life. It wasn't a cougar, I know what those sound like. It was a long, pealing, horrendous wail full of mind-bending hate. At that moment, I was sure I was about to die, that I had made a terrible mistake and now I was going to pay the price. Something was moving in the dark shadows of the sparse pine trees right in front of me. Not moving like an animal, not a deer or even a bear, both of which I had encountered before. A lurching motion of four limbs with a shadow the size of a man. It was coming towards me. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. Every nightmare a child has ever had about a monster chasing them while they couldn't run away was coming true. After that scream, everything was quiet. It wasn't making any noise as they moved towards me. No crackling of dry pine needles, no breathing, nothing. I couldn't move. Tears are streaming down my face now. The terror I put away is coming back. I think I tried to run. I remember fleeing faster than I had ever moved in my entire life. Total silence, just the pounding of my feet and the scrambling of my hands in the pine needles and dirt and roots. I fell. I remember panting, face in the dirt, knowing I was about to die. I remember the silence coming over me and a terrible chill. I remember the feeling of my bladder loosening and heat flooding down my legs. I don't remember what came after that. When I came, it was early morning. The sun was beginning to rise. My only thought was to somehow make it home before my dad woke up, and I ran flat out many miles back home. My dogs snarled at me, snapping at my heels as I jumped our back fence. It was so confusing because we were the best of friends since I was only enough to play with them. I had larger worries though because my dad was up. I managed to climb in through the window to my bedroom and change. I went to school that day, but they sent me home with a fever. I never explored at night again. And I was never the same. My dogs never acted the same around me again either. I went from an almost too social, active young man to a complete and total social recluse almost overnight. I barely spoke for a very long time, and I almost failed to graduate high school. It was like nothing could ever matter to me ever again. I don't know what happened, but I know something happened. I am sorry. It was very hard to write this with any coherency because recalling this completely is making me nearly break down again. Till tonight I hadn't cried in almost a decade, and that was when I buried those dogs I mentioned. And they had to be put down from old age and infirmity. I don't know what the F is going on, but I feel like it was important to share. Okay, I know in part 1 of this thread I mentioned that I was trying to take what the OP said as truth when discussing possibilities of what happened for the sake of discussion, but I'm having a really hard time with this one. Maybe this happened, and it really did shake the OP to their very core, but they talk about how hard it was to write with any coherency, and yet are giving descriptions of every little detail like they're writing an entry in their horror novel. I don't know, I'm probably being a little too harsh. I'd be happy to hear what you all think in the comments. I don't want to just rag on this person, but you all share whatever you think. Story 2. I've got a solid hiking resume, including an Appalachian through, more nights outdoors than I can count, and a lot of those were solo. Not much faces me in the woods. I've had a bear in my camp, coyotes very close, a copperhead slither across my foot. Okay, that was kind of scary. Don't move, don't sneeze, don't move. I used to go out alone in the Sam Houston National Forest back before I got married. Packing out my normal stuff, a couple of beers, or maybe a flask and a book, it was just me time to get out and decompress. I'd done this a dozen times or more, go out about 5 to 7 miles or so on the Lone Star Trail, camp for the evening, hike out the next morning, no biggie. One weird night, I drank my beer while reading one of the Wheel of Time books. My fire had burned down to the embers and I drifted off, slightly buzzed but far from what anyone would call drunk. Suddenly, I was wide awake with all kinds of crap ain't right alarms going off in my head. Adrenaline was surging, but I stayed still and tried to get a handle on things. Low moonlight, enough to make out my immediate surroundings. It was almost perfectly still and quiet, more so than I've ever experienced except for a buzzing noise, kind of like cicadas, but way out of season for them and very steady. I absolutely could not pinpoint a direction. It seemed to come from all over. When I finally mustered up the courage to move, I crammed everything in my pack and hauled butt out of there in the dark, absolutely terrified. I only turned on my headlamp when I was well clear of camp and unsure of the trail. I'd probably cover half the distance back to my Jeep, 3 miles or so, when I could no longer hear the buzzing, but I never felt like it was behind me. It was all around me, then it just kind of faded off. I still have no clue what set me off that night. I've never experienced anything like that since then. Ooh, now this is interesting. I don't particularly think anything supernatural was going on, but I couldn't tell you what was making that noise. Maybe some machinery nearby, vibrating through ground rock, I don't know. I am sure some weird phenomenon that would be wild to learn about. The interesting part is, I feel like this happened because you're such an outdoors person that when all the animals got freaked out at this strange sound, that is what freaked out your brain. You are so in tune with nature out there that when nature freaks out, your subconscious friggin' notices. Very cool. Story 3. When I was about 10, I went camping with my family. It was a provincial park we had never been to, so my dad asked me if I wanted to go for a paddle in the canoe after we had finished setting up the site. I said sure, and when we finished, we set off. We came up to this part of the lake that narrowed into a river, and then the water level dropped almost completely, revealing some rocks. My dad wanted to portage over them, but since I was too young to help with the canoe, he carried me over the rocks and I waited for him to bring the canoe. We got back into the canoe after getting past the rocks and set off. But we didn't realize that just after the rocks, the river went around a bend and then just ended there. So we headed back. My dad carried me to the other end of the rocks, and I waited for him to bring the canoe. He went out of my sight line doing this. I just hung around and looked around when I saw a very large black blob on the side of the river. I was basically in the middle of the river on the rocks. I called for my dad, but he was too far away to hear me. I started to get really scared because the blob looked over at me. I thought it was a black cougar or something. It definitely wasn't a bear. It had the shape of a large cat. It had these yellow eyes and just stared at me. Freaked me right the hell out. I started screaming for my dad and it just kept staring at me. It felt like forever for my dad to return, but when my dad finally did come back, he said he didn't see anything over there. I can't remember if I actually saw something and it left before my dad came back or if my mind was just making things up. I have zero intentions of ever visiting that provincial park ever again, but I still like to camp. I mean, honestly, could have been some kind of cat with just really black fur, or maybe the lighting made it look black. And honestly, the moment you looked over at your dad, the cat could have gotten nervous and ran off without you even noticing. Hard to say. I wish I knew the location so I could venture some guesses as to what it could possibly be. Story 4. Not necessarily paranormal, but I had a bizarre run-in with other people while backpacking. I was in Yosemite National Park about a year and a half ago in March. My trip began when the snow started to fall again, making it fairly cold. In the high country, between about 3 to 4 of the way between Upper Yosemite Falls and El Capitan, my buddy and I were making camp for the night and attempting to light a fire with our stove. This is probably when it's around 5 in the afternoon, pretty close to sundown, and we were fairly close to the trail because we were in about 1 to 2 feet of snow without our snowshoes. We were collecting what dry sticks we could find to start our fire. Then we heard some voices coming from the direction of the trail coming from El Capitan, and eventually see a mother and 2 kids, probably between 12 and 1.5 years old, talking amongst themselves not 20 meters from myself and Buddy. They were dressed for hiking but had no packs, a fairly bizarre sight at this time of the year, and considering we were miles from any park campsite or lodging. There was also no trail open starting on the other side of El Capitan to the falls, either meaning they were returning from El Cap with no gear or rain/snow attire. They just kept on hiking along the trail like it was normal to be in such a location on the trail so late in the day. They didn't appear to see us at all either, which was weird because we were in plain view of the trail. If they did, they paid no attention to us whatsoever. They were long gone before I could get back to camp and ask if my friend had seen them. He said he had seen them and was just as confused as I was, since the sun would set in a matter of about 45 minutes. Story 5. This one time I went camping when I was about 13 with my family up in Michigan, somewhere near where that mountain Sugarloaf is. It's around 3 a.m. and I'm wide awake reading a comic book I'd brought. I was a pretty huge insomniac, could only sleep for a few hours at a time, when I heard twigs breaking and leaves rustling somewhere to the back edge of our campsite. It's hard to explain, but I feel not afraid but extremely aware, like how I imagine rabbits feel when they sense a predator is nearby. I remember flipping onto my stomach and edging toward my little sister who was against the outer edge of the tent. I wasn't thinking about it at the time, but I think I was instinctively moving to protect her from, I don't know. All of a sudden, it stands, its shadow curving along the roof of the tent. I'm waiting for my life to flash before my eyes, but I'm just pulling a blank. All I feel is pure horror, of the likes I've never felt again. But then the shadow just disappears. Whatever it was, it left. The sound of underbrush moving as it left is the only thing that convinced me I wasn't hallucinating. I stayed up the rest of the night. Sure, it was going to come back. It didn't, and I refused to camp anywhere in the Midwest since, for the rest of the trip. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.